Sometimes coming home means facing the things you've been running from. For young Daniel, returning to his family's farm after veterinary school was supposed to be about helping his aging father, not confronting painful truths about neglect and care. When neighbor Henrik called about his limping sheep, Daniel expected a simple infection. The wounded Awe stood in the corner, trembling and favoring her blackened leg. As Daniel knelt to examine the festering wound, he thought it would be routine. But when he probed deeper into the infected tissue, his fingers found something shocking. Buried inside was a length of baling twine, deliberately placed and left to rot. This wasn't accident or disease. Someone had caused the suffering and walked away. The discovery would force Daniel to see his own father's struggles in a new light and question how often people choose to look away from pain rather than tend to it. Would Daniel find the courage to confront this cruelty, or would he become another person who chooses silence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Daniel first saw his father forget his own sheep's names, he knew something fundamental had shifted in the world he'd grown up in. It happened on a Tuesday in early September, when the autumn light filtered through the kitchen window, in that particular way that made everything look both golden and fragile. His father, Thomas Hartwell, stood at the pasture gate holding a bucket of grain, staring at the flock with an expression Daniel had never seen before, confusion mixed with something that looked almost like fear. "The brown one with the white face," his father had said slowly, pointing at his Awe Daniel knew had been called Molly for the past 6 years. "What's her name again?" Daniel had felt something cold settle in his stomach, but he'd answered gently, "That's Molly, Dad. She's the one who always comes running when you call." Thomas had nodded and smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, and Daniel saw him write Molly on the back of his weathered hand with a pencil stub he kept in his shirt pocket. That was 3 months ago, and since then, Daniel had been making the 2-hour drive from veterinary school every weekend, watching his father navigate a world that seemed to be slipping away from him in small, heartbreaking increments. The man who had taught Daniel to read the sky for weather changes, to know which ewes would be good mothers just by watching them graze, to understand that caring for animals was really about paying attention to the smallest details. That man was still there, but he was fading like an old photograph left too long in the sun. The Hartwell farm sat in a valley between 2 gentle hills, surrounded by stone walls that Daniel's great-grandfather had built with his own hands in 1923. The farmhouse was white-clapboard with green shutters, practical and sturdy, with a wraparound porch where Daniel's mother used to shell peas in. The summer evenings before cancer took her when Daniel was 16. His father had never remarried, pouring all his love into the land and the animals and his son in that order, though Daniel had always suspected the order might shift depending on the season and his father's mood. The barn was older than the house, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood, with a weathered copper rooster wader vane that still turned true with every change of wind. Inside, the smell was a mixture of hay and lanolin, leather and thyme scent that could transport Daniel instantly back to childhood, to summer mornings when he'd helped his father with the dawn milking of their small dairy herd, before they'd switched exclusively to sheep. Daniel had always planned to take over the farm eventually, but veterinary school had opened his eyes to possibilities beyond the valley. He'd excelled in his studies, particularly in large animal medicine, and had been offered an internship at a prestigious practice in the state capital. The decision had been weighing on him for months, complicated now by his father's condition, which they'd both been pretending was just normal aging until it became impossible to ignore. The kitchen was the heart of the farmhouse, with a cast-iron wood stove that his father still used for cooking, claiming it made everything taste better than those electric contraptions. The oak table bore the scars of 3 generations of family meals, homework sessions, and the careful stitching of torn work clothes. On the windowsill sat a collection of his mother's ceramic roosters, each one a gift from a different neighbor or friend. Each one dusted religiously by his father every Sunday morning. It was at this table that Daniel found his father on the furthestly. Morning Henrik called about the sheep, sitting with a cup of coffee that had grown cold and a piece of buttered toast that remained untouched. Thomas was staring out the window at the pasture, and Daniel could see him counting the sheep under his breath, his lips moving silently as he pointed at each one. 42, his father said when he noticed Daniel watching. We should have 43. Daniel looked out at the flock, clustered near the water trough in the early morning coolness. He counted quickly 43 sheep, all accounted for, but he didn't correct his father. Instead, he poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and sat down across from the man who had taught him everything important about life. Sleep well? Daniel asked, though he knew his father had been up twice in the night, checking the locks on doors that were already secure, looking for things that weren't lost. Well enough, Thomas replied, taking a sip of his cold coffee and making a face. Strange dreams, though. Dreamed about your mother. She was young again, wearing that blue dress she had when we first met. She told me to pay attention to the details, that the important things are often hidden in plain sight. Daniel felt his throat tighten. His father's dreams about his mother had become more frequent lately, and they always left him with an expression of profound loneliness that broke Daniel's heart. She was always good at noticing things others missed, he said softly. That she was. Thomas stood and walked to the window, pressing his palm against the glass. She would have known what to do about Henrik's boy. This was the first Daniel had heard about any problem with Henrik Mueller, their neighbor whose property bordered theirs to the east. Henrik was a decent man in his 70s, a widower who ran a small flock of sheep with the help of his son, Carl, who was Daniel's age but had never shown much interest in farming. Carl worked construction in town and helped his father only reluctantly, usually when threatened with losing his weekend poker money. What about Carl? Daniel asked. His father turned from the window, and for a moment his eyes were sharp and clear, the way they used to be when he was explaining something important. Boys got no respect for the animals, treats them like machinery instead of living creatures. Henrik knows it but won't say anything. Sometimes being a good father means being blind to your children's faults, but that blindness can cost innocent creatures. Before Daniel could ask what his father meant, the phone rang, an old rotary model that hung on the kitchen wall, its brass bells clanging with a sound that belonged to a different era. Thomas answered it with the formal politeness of his generation. Hartwell? Farm. Thomas speaking. A pause. Henrik, good morning. How can I help you? Another pause, longer this time, and Daniel watched his father's face grow concerned. Of course, I'll send Daniel right over. He'll take good care of her. When his father hung up, he turned to Daniel with an expression that was both relieved and troubled. Henrik's got a A-way that's been limping for a few days. Asked if you'd take a look. I told him you'd be right over. Daniel nodded, already moving toward the mudroom where he kept his veterinary bag. It was a leather satchel his parents had given him when he started school, worn soft now from use, containing the basic supplies he needed for farm calls, antibiotics, wound dressing, syringes, a thermometer, and the various tools of his trade. Probably just an abscess, he called over his shoulder as he checked his supplies. Probably, his father agreed, but something in his tone made Daniel pause. Dad, is there something you're not telling me? Thomas Hartwell stood in the kitchen doorway, framed by the morning light, looking every one of his 74 years. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience and the sadness of a man who had seen too much of the world's casual cruelty. Sometimes, son, the wound we can see isn't the one that needs the most healing. Daniel didn't fully understand what his father meant, but he nodded anyway, shouldering his bag and stepping out into the crisp September morning. The sun was just burning off the last of the dew, and the air carried the scent of apples and wood smoke from someone's chimney. It was the kind of morning that made a person grateful to be alive, to be part of something larger than themselves. The walk to Henrik's farm took 15 minutes across the meadow that separated their properties, following a path worn smooth by generations of neighborly visits. Daniel had walked this route countless times as a child, sometimes carrying fresh eggs to trade for Henrik's wife's famous apple butter, sometimes just because his mother believed that good neighbors stayed connected to each other's lives. As he crested the small hill that marked the boundary between the farms, Daniel could see Henrik waiting by his barn, a slight figure in work clothes that had been mended and remended until they were more patched than original fabric. Even from a distance, Daniel could see the worry in the old man's posture, the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot like a man who had been carrying a burden too heavy for him to bear alone. The morning was about to teach Daniel that some discoveries change everything, that healing isn't just about antibiotics and bandages, and that sometimes the most important veterinary work has nothing to do with animals at all. Henrik Mueller looked older than his 73 years as he stood waiting by the gate to his sheep pen, his hands clasped behind his back, in the way of men who have learned that some troubles are too heavy to carry in their arms alone. When he saw Daniel approaching across the meadow, his weathered face creased into what might have been relief or simply exhaustion. It was difficult to tell which. "Daniel, thank you for coming so quickly," Henrik said, his voice carrying the slight accent that marked him as one of the German families who had settled in the valley after the Second World War. "I apologize for bothering you so early, but I've been watching this A-Way for 3 days now, and I think it's beyond what I can handle." Daniel set down his veterinary bag and shook the older man's hand, noting the tremor that Henrik tried to hide. "No bother at all, Mr. Mueller. Dad said she's been limping?" "Yes, her left rear leg. She won't put weight on it. And yesterday, I noticed the area around her hoof had turned black. I tried to examine it myself, but..." Henrik's voice trailed off, and he gestured helplessly toward the pen where a medium-sized A-Way stood apart from the small flock, her head lowered in the universal posture of an animal in pain. Daniel studied the sheep from a distance first, noting her isolation from the others, the way she held her injured legs slightly raised, the dullness in her eyes that spoke of prolonged discomfort. These were all signs he'd learned to read in veterinary school, but seeing them in person on a farm where he'd played as a child gave them a weight that textbooks couldn't convey. "When did you first notice the limping?" Daniel asked as he opened his bag and pulled on a pair of latex gloves. "Saturday morning, I think, or maybe Friday night. Time gets away from me sometimes." Henrik's confusion was evident, and Daniel wondered if the old man was experiencing the same kind of memory issues that plagued his father. Carl was supposed to check on them Friday, but he had to work late, or maybe it was something else. I can't remember exactly. The mention of Carl created a small knot of unease in Daniel's stomach, though he couldn't say why. Carl Mueller had always been pleasant enough in their limited interactions over the years, but there had been something in his father's earlier comment about the young man that suggested deeper concerns. "Well, let's take a look at her," Daniel said, approaching the pen with the calm, deliberate movements his professors had taught him were essential when dealing with stressed animals. The A-Way didn't try to run when Daniel entered the pen, which was itself a sign of how much pain she was in. Healthy sheep were naturally wary and would typically move away from strangers, but this animal simply stood trembling, her breathing shallow and rapid. Daniel spoke to her in the soft, reassuring tones his father had taught him to use with frightened animals. Not the words that mattered, but the tone, the patience, the promise that help had arrived. "Easy, girl. I'm here to help," he murmured, running his hand gently along her flank before kneeling beside her injured leg. The smell hit him first, the sickly sweet odor of infected tissue that any farm-raised person would recognize. But there was something else underneath it, something that didn't belong in a typical wound. Daniel lifted the ewe's hoof carefully, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The entire area around the hoof was swollen and discolored, black and purple with infection that had been allowed to fester for far longer than 3 days. The flesh was hot to the touch and gave way under gentle pressure, indicating advanced necrosis. But it was what Daniel saw when he probed more deeply that changed everything. Embedded in the infected tissue, barely visible beneath the layers of dead flesh and pus, was a length of baling twine. It had been inserted deliberately, deep enough to cause maximum damage, and left there to work its slow destruction. This wasn't the result of an accident or natural injury. Someone had done this intentionally. Daniel sat back on his heels, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. In all his years of training, in all the farm emergencies he'd responded to, he had never encountered deliberate cruelty like this. The twine had been pushed deep into the sheep's hoof, creating a foreign body that would guarantee infection and prolong suffering. "Mr. Mueller," Daniel said carefully, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "When exactly did Carl last handle this A-way?" Henrik moved closer to the pen, peering down at Daniel with eyes that suddenly seemed sharper, more focused. "Why do you ask?" "Because this isn't a natural injury. Someone put baling twine into this animal's hoof. Deep enough to cause infection, painful enough to make her lame, and hidden well enough that it might go unnoticed until the infection became severe." The silence that followed Daniel's words stretched between them like a bridge that neither man wanted to cross. Henrik's face went through a series of changes: surprise, disbelief, and finally a terrible understanding that Daniel recognized as the look of a father realizing something devastating about his child. "That's not possible," Henrik said quietly, but his voice lacked conviction. Daniel carefully extracted a portion of the twine with his forceps, holding it up to the morning light. It was the same rough hemp baling twine that every farm in the valley used, nothing distinctive about it except for its placement and the deliberate nature of its insertion. "I'm going to have to clean this out completely and treat the infection," Daniel said, his professional training taking over even as his mind reeled with the implications of what he'd found. "She's going to need antibiotics, and there's a good chance she'll lose part of the hoof. The infection has been spreading for a while, probably more than a week." Henrik sank onto a nearby hay bale, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. Carl was supposed to separate this A-way last Thursday. She'd been acting aggressive with the others, pushing them away from the feed. He said he'd take care of it. The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. An aggressive A-way would need to be handled roughly, restrained, perhaps even hobbled temporarily. It would be easy enough for someone with a cruel streak to use that opportunity to inflict hidden damage to teach the animal a lesson that no one would discover until it was too late to trace back to its source. "Mr. Mueller, I need to ask you directly, has Carl shown any signs of impatience or anger toward the animals?" Any indication that he might. Daniel struggled to find the right words. How do you ask a father if his son is capable of deliberate cruelty? "He's never liked farming," Henrik said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Says the animals are stupid, that they're more trouble than they're worth. But I never thought." He stopped, his hands shaking as he covered his face. "Dear God, what kind of father am I that I didn't see this?" Daniel felt a wave of sympathy for the old man, remembering his father's earlier words about the blindness that sometimes comes with love. But sympathy couldn't undo the damage that had been done, couldn't erase the suffering this animal had endured because someone had chosen to inflict pain rather than deal with their frustration in a healthy way. As Daniel began the careful process, of cleaning the wound and removing every trace of the embedded twine. He found himself thinking about his own father's struggles with memory and independence. There were parallels here that made him uncomfortable. The tendency to look away from difficult truths, to make excuses for behavior that couldn't be excused, to choose the comfort of denial over the responsibility of action. The Awe stood patiently through the treatment, as if she understood that healing had finally arrived. Daniel worked with methodical precision, irrigating the wound, applying antiseptic, preparing the injection of broad-spectrum antibiotics that would fight the infection from within. But even as his hands performed the familiar motions of veterinary care, his mind was wrestling with larger questions about duty and courage, about the difference between helping and enabling, about when silence becomes complicity. When he finished, Daniel sat back and looked at Henrik, who had been watching the entire procedure with the intensity of a man searching for absolution. "She'll recover," Daniel said. "The hoof will heal, though she may always have a slight limp. The infection will clear up with proper antibiotic treatment." "And Carl?" Henrik asked, the question hanging in the air like smoke. Daniel packed his instruments carefully, giving himself time to choose his words. "That's not for me to decide. But if it were my son, I'd want to know why he felt the need to hurt something that couldn't fight back. And I'd want to make sure it never happened again." The walk home across the meadow felt longer than usual, weighted with the knowledge that some wounds run deeper than flesh, and that healing sometimes requires confronting truths that are easier left buried. Daniel found himself thinking about the baling twine in his bag, evidence of cruelty that someone had tried to hide, expecting it would never be discovered. As he climbed the hill toward his family's farm, he wondered what other hidden wounds he'd been trained not to see. The conversation Daniel had been dreading began the moment he walked through the kitchen door and found his father sitting at the oak table with a cup of tea grown cold, staring at a piece of paper covered in his own handwriting notes about sheep breeding schedules that made perfect sense until the third line, where the words began to wander off into meaningless fragments. "How's Henrik's Awe?" Thomas asked without looking up from the paper, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who suspected he already knew the answer would be complicated. Daniel hung his veterinary bag on its hook by the door and poured himself a glass of water from the tap, buying time while he decided how much of the truth to share. The discovery of the embedded baling twine sat in his mind like a stone, heavy with implications that stretched far beyond one injured animal. "She'll recover," he said finally, settling into the chair across from his father. "But it wasn't what I expected." Thomas looked up then, his eyes sharp with the intelligence that still surfaced clearly despite the fog that increasingly clouded his thoughts. "Wasn't natural, was it?" The directness of the question caught Daniel off guard. "What makes you say that?" "Because I've seen that look on your face before. It's the same expression you had when you found those cats someone had been poisoning behind the feed store when you were 12. Like you discovered that the world contains more deliberate cruelty than you were prepared to handle." Daniel remembered that incident clearly, the 3 dead cats he'd found while helping his father pick up grain, the way his stomach had twisted when the veterinarian confirmed they'd been given antifreeze mixed with food. His father had sat him down that evening and explained that some people carry pain inside them that they don't know how to bear, so they try to pass it along to creatures that can't defend themselves. "Someone put baling twine into her hoof," Daniel said quietly, "deep enough to guarantee infection, hidden well enough that it might never have been found if the lameness hadn't gotten severe enough for Henrik to call for help." Thomas nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Carl, it wasn't a question," and Daniel felt a chill at his father's certainty. "You knew?" "I suspected. Been noticing things over the past few months, small cruelties that could be explained away as accidents or bad luck. A fence gate left open just wide enough to let sheep wander onto the road. Feed contaminated with engine oil. Nothing dramatic enough to prove malice, but too consistent to be coincidence. Daniel stared at his father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in months. Despite the memory lapses and confusion, Thomas Hartwell's fundamental understanding of animal behavior and human nature remained intact. The man who had taught Daniel to read the subtle signs of illness in livestock had been applying those same observational skills to their neighbors. "Why didn't you say anything?" Daniel asked. Thomas gestured at the paper covered with his deteriorating handwriting, a gesture that encompassed not just the failing notes, but his entire situation. Who would believe an old man whose mind is starting to slip? And what proof did I have? Suspicions aren't evidence, and accusations without evidence destroy communities. The weight of his father's isolation hit Daniel like a physical blow. Here was a man who had spent his life caring for animals and watching over his neighbors, now trapped by his own declining faculties into silence about something that clearly troubled him deeply. "But you told me to pay attention to Henrik's boy weeks ago," Daniel said, remembering the cryptic warning his father had given. "I hoped you'd see it for yourself and make your own decisions." A young veterinarian making observations carries more weight than an old farmer losing his memory. Thomas reached across the table and touched Daniel's hand. "What are you going to do now that you know?" It was the question Daniel had been avoiding during the walk home, the decision he wasn't prepared to make. Confronting Carl directly would accomplish nothing. The young man would simply deny everything and become more careful about hiding his cruelty. Involving the authorities seemed extreme for what could still be written off as circumstantial evidence, but doing nothing felt like becoming complicit in whatever future suffering Carl might inflict. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "Henrik knows the truth now, but he's in an impossible position. How do you report your own son for animal cruelty when you depend on him to help run the farm? Same way you decide whether to put a parent in a nursing home when they start forgetting to turn off the stove," Thomas said quietly. "You weigh the harm of action against the harm of inaction, and you try to choose the path that protects the most innocent lives." The parallel hung in the air between them, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Daniel looked at his father really, looked at him and saw not just the memory lapses and confusion, but the fear underneath it all. Fear of becoming a burden, fear of losing independence, fear of being seen as incompetent by the son he'd spent his life teaching and protecting. "Dad," Daniel said carefully, "are you trying to tell me something about your own situation?" Thomas smiled, and for a moment his eyes held all the warmth and clarity. "I'm trying to tell you that love sometimes means making hard choices that feel like betrayal, but are actually acts of courage. I'm trying to tell you that protecting someone doesn't always mean pretending their problems don't exist." Before Daniel could respond, the sound of a truck pulling into their driveway interrupted the conversation. Through the kitchen window, they could see Carl Muller's battered pickup truck, its tailgate secured with the same type of baling twine that Daniel had extracted from the injured ewe's hoof. Carl climbed out of the truck slowly, his movements carrying the deliberate casualness of someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say. He was a stocky young man with prematurely thinning hair and the kind of pale complexion that spoke of too much time indoors, though his hands showed the calluses of someone who did occasional physical labor. "Daniel," Carl called out as he approached the kitchen door. "Heard you were over helping my dad this morning. Thought I'd stop by and see if there was anything I could do to help." The offer of assistance would have seemed neighborly under normal circumstances, but knowing what Daniel now knew about the deliberate cruelty Carl had inflicted, it felt more like a predator checking to see if his tracks had been discovered. Thomas stood up from the table with the careful movements of a man whose joints had begun to betray him. "I'll let you handle this," he said to Daniel. "I need to check on our Own flock, anyway. As his father headed for the door, Daniel saw him palm something from the table, the piece of paper with his deteriorating handwriting, evidence of his own failing capabilities that he didn't want Carl to see. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the pride and vulnerability that his father carried. Like twin burdens, Carl knocked on the screen door with false cheerfulness. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Daniel took a deep breath and went to meet him, knowing that this conversation would determine whether he was going to be someone who confronted difficult truths or someone who chose the easier path of willful blindness. In his pocket, wrapped in a tissue, lay the piece of baling twine he'd removed from the sheep's wound, evidence that would either remain his secret or become the catalyst for something larger and more difficult. The choice, he realized, would define not just what kind of veterinarian he would become, but what kind of man. Carl Mueller stood on the porch with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, his smile just a fraction too wide to be genuine. Up close, Daniel could see the nervous energy that vibrated beneath the younger man's attempt at casual friendliness. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes kept darting toward the barn where Thomas had gone to check on their sheep. "So how's Dad's A-way doing?" Carl asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew more about the animal's condition than a concerned son should. "He's been worried sick about her all week." Daniel studied Carl's face, looking for tells the way his father had taught him to read animals, the subtle signs that revealed what lay beneath the surface. What he saw was a man trying very hard to appear nonchalant while fishing for information about how much had been discovered. "She recover," Daniel said carefully, "though it was more serious than your father initially thought." "Oh, what was wrong with her?" Carl shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a movement that might have looked casual if not for the tension that ran through his entire body. "Infected wound. Foreign object embedded in the tissue." Daniel kept his voice level, professional, watching for Carl's reaction to the clinical description. For just a moment, Carl's facade slipped, and Daniel saw something flicker across his features. Not surprise, but calculation. The look of someone trying to determine how much trouble they might be in. Foreign object? Like what? A thorn or something? "Baling twine," Daniel said quietly, deliberately placed. The silence that followed stretched between them like a taut wire. Carl's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its false cheerfulness. "That's crazy. Who would do something like that?" It was the wrong question to ask, not "how did that happen?" or "are you sure?" but "who would do that?" as if the possibility of deliberate cruelty was something he'd considered before. Daniel felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. "That's what I've been wondering," Daniel replied. "Your father mentioned you were the last one to handle that particular A-way. Something about separating her from the flock because she was being aggressive?" Carl's face flushed red, then went pale. The color changes so rapid they might have been comical under different circumstances. "I don't remember any specific A-way. We handle lots of animals. Things happen. Things happen," Daniel repeated slowly. "That's an interesting way to put it." "Look, I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything," Daniel interrupted. "I'm telling you that someone deliberately inserted baling twine into that animal's hoof, deep enough to cause prolonged suffering, hidden well enough that it might never have been discovered. I'm telling you that this wasn't an accident or bad luck, it was cruelty." Carl took a step backward, his hands coming out of his pockets to gesture defensively. "You can't prove I had anything to do with that. Just because I was the last one to handle her doesn't mean." He stopped abruptly, realizing he'd just confirmed something Daniel hadn't directly accused him of. The admission hung in the air between them, damning its implications. "I didn't say you were responsible," Daniel said quietly. "You just did." For a moment, Carl looked like he might try to continue the charade, But something in Daniel's steady gaze seemed to deflate his remaining pretense. His shoulders sagged, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of sullen defensiveness. That Away was a pain in the ass, always causing trouble, pushing the others around, making extra work. Maybe she needed to learn some respect. The casual way he said it, as if teaching an animal respect through torture, was a reasonable response to inconvenience, made Daniel's stomach turn. This wasn't a moment of anger or frustration that had gotten out of hand. This was calculated cruelty disguised as discipline. Animals don't learn respect through pain, Daniel said, his voice steady, despite the anger building in his chest. They learn fear, and fear makes them more difficult to handle, not less. Carl shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both indifference and contempt. Easy for you to say. You get to play veterinarian on weekends and then go back to your fancy school. Some of us are stuck dealing with these stupid animals every day. The bitterness in Carl's voice revealed something Daniel hadn't expected, a deep resentment, not just toward the animals he was supposed to care for, but toward anyone who seemed to have more options than he did. It didn't excuse the cruelty, but it provided a context that made the behavior more understandable, if no less disturbing. You're not stuck, Daniel said. You choose to stay. And if you can't handle animals without hurting them, you should choose to do something else. Right, because jobs are just growing on trees around here. Because guys like me have all kinds of opportunities to do whatever we want. Carl's laugh was harsh and bitter. You know what the difference is between you and me, Daniel? Your daddy's not falling apart. You've got choices. The words hit closer to home than Carl probably realized. Daniel thought about his father's declining memory, the difficult decisions that lay ahead, the way love sometimes required actions that felt like betrayal. But personal struggles didn't justify inflicting suffering on innocent creatures. Having limited choices doesn't give you the right to take out your frustration on animals that can't defend themselves, Daniel said. Spare me the lecture, Carl snapped. You want to know the truth? Sometimes I get tired of pretending to care about sheep that are too stupid to come in out of the rain. Sometimes I get tired of cleaning up after animals that exist to be eaten anyway. And sometimes, when one of them gives me extra trouble, I make sure it remembers not to do it again. The casual admission of repeated cruelty sent a chill down Daniel's spine. This wasn't an isolated incident or a moment of poor judgment. It was a pattern of behavior that would continue unless something changed. Does your father know? Daniel asked. Carl's expression shifted, becoming defensive and almost vulnerable. My father's got enough problems without worrying about every little thing that happens on the farm. Besides, what he doesn't know won't hurt him. It was the same logic people used to justify all kinds of harmful secrets, the belief that ignorance was kinder than truth. Daniel thought about his own father's situation, about the temptation to hide problems rather than address them, about the difference between protecting someone and enabling them to remain in dangerous situations. From across the yard came the sound of Thomas calling the sheep, his voice carrying the patient authority of a man who had spent his life working with animals. The familiar sound seemed to emphasize the contrast between his father's approach to farming and the cruelty that Carl had just admitted to. I can't let this continue, Daniel said finally. Carl's face hardened. And what exactly do you think you're going to do about it? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Daniel realized that Carl was right to ask it. What exactly was he prepared to do? Report Carl to authorities who would demand more proof than a piece of baling twine and a confession made in anger? Confront Henrik with evidence that would force an elderly man to choose between his livelihood and his conscience. The moral clarity that had sustained Daniel through the morning's discoveries began to waver in the face of practical complications. I'm going to make sure it stops, Daniel said, though even as he spoke the words, he wasn't entirely sure what they meant. Carl laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You're gonna make sure it stops, right? And how exactly are you planning to do that? You going to stand guard over every sheep in the valley? You going to follow me around, making sure I don't step out of line?" Before Daniel could respond, the sound of his father's voice calling from the barn interrupted them. "Daniel, could you come here for a minute?" There was something in Thomas's tone that made both men turn toward the barn, not alarm. Exactly, but an urgency that suggested something required immediate attention. Daniel felt torn between the unfinished confrontation with Carl and his father's call for help. "We're not done talking," Daniel said to Carl. "Oh, I think we are," Carl replied, already backing toward his truck. "I think we're completely done talking." Daniel watched Carl drive away, gravel spinning under his tires in a display of defiance that felt more like retreat. Then he headed toward the barn, where he found his father standing in the center aisle between the stalls, staring at their own flock with an expression of profound confusion. "Dad, what's wrong?" Thomas turned to face him, and Daniel saw something that made his heart skip. His father was holding a piece of baling twine, the same rough hemp variety that had been embedded in Henrik's away. But this piece was different. It was stained with blood. "I found this caught on the fence post by the water trough," Thomas said slowly. "And Daniel, I counted the sheep 3 times. We're missing one." The implication hit Daniel like a physical blow. While he'd been confronting Carl about past cruelty, someone had been busy creating new victims. "Which one is missing?" "The young Away with the brown patch over her left eye. Penny. She was here this morning when I did the first count." But now Thomas's voice trailed off, and Daniel could see him struggling to trust his own perceptions, to separate what he knew from what his failing memory might be telling him. Daniel quickly counted the flock himself, confirming what his father had discovered. 42 sheep instead of 43, and Penny, a yearling Away who had always been particularly gentle and trusting, was nowhere to be seen. "When did you last see her?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Right before Carl arrived. She was grazing near the gate, close enough that I spoke to her when I came out to check the flock." Thomas held up the blood-stained twine. "This wasn't here this morning." Daniel felt a cold fury building in his chest. Carl hadn't just come to their farm to gauge how much Daniel knew about his cruelty. He'd come to send a message. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. While Daniel had been inside the house, confronting Carl about past crimes, the young man had been outside committing new ones. "We need to search for her," Daniel said, though part of him dreaded what they might find. They spent the next hour combing every corner of their property, calling Penny's name and checking all the places where a sheep might wander or seek shelter. Thomas moved with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had spent his life tracking lost animals. His confusion about other matters temporarily set aside in the face of immediate crisis. It was Daniel who found her, in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from the barn, hidden behind a stand of oak trees that blocked the view from the house. Penny was alive, but barely. She lay on her side, breathing in shallow gasps, her left rear leg twisted at a natural angle and secured to a fallen branch with baling twine that had been pulled so tight it had cut into her flesh. The cruelty was more elaborate than what had been done to Henrik's Away, more deliberate in its design. Carl had clearly spent time constructing this torture, positioning the sheep where she would be hidden from casual observation, but where she would slowly die from exposure and dehydration unless someone happened to search for her specifically. "Dear God," Thomas whispered when he arrived at the clearing and saw what Daniel had found. Daniel knelt beside Penny, speaking in the soft, reassuring tones that came automatically in the presence of suffering, while his hands worked to free her from the twisted twine. The rope had been tied with deliberate complexity, designed not just to restrain, but to cause maximum pain with every movement the animal made. "Easy, girl. You're safe now." I'm going to get you free." As Daniel worked to untangle the elaborate knots, he found himself thinking about patterns of escalation, about how unchecked cruelty tends to grow more sophisticated and more sadistic over time. This wasn't the work of someone acting out in a moment of frustration. This was the work of someone who had taken pleasure in devising new ways to cause suffering. "This is my fault," Thomas said quietly, watching Daniel's careful work. "I should have acted on my suspicions weeks ago. I should have found a way to warn Henrik, to protect these animals." "This isn't your fault, Dad. This is Carl's choice, Carl's responsibility." "But I knew," Thomas insisted. "I saw the signs and I chose to remain silent because I was afraid no one would believe me. I let my own problems become an excuse for inaction." Daniel freed the last of the twisted rope and carefully examined Penny's injured leg. The bone wasn't broken, but the circulation had been cut off long enough to cause significant tissue damage. She would recover, but she would bear the scars of this cruelty for the rest of her life. As they carefully carried Penny back to the barn, where Daniel could treat her injuries properly, Thomas spoke with the kind of clarity that had become increasingly rare in recent months. "You know what the real tragedy is? Carl's not evil, not in the way we usually think of it. He's just someone who learned to pass along his pain instead of dealing with it. Someone who discovered that hurting creatures weaker than himself made him feel temporarily powerful instead of permanently powerless." Daniel looked at his father with new respect. Despite the memory lapses and confusion that plagued him, Thomas Hartwell still possessed the kind of wisdom that came from a lifetime of observing human and animal nature. "Understanding him doesn't excuse what he's done," Daniel said. "No, it doesn't. But understanding might be the key to stopping him. People like Carl don't respond to confrontation or threats. They escalate. They respond to being seen clearly, to being held accountable by people who refuse to look away." As they settled Penny into a clean stall and Daniel began treating her wounds, he realized that his father was talking about more than just Carl's cruelty. He was talking about all the ways people choose silence over action, comfort over courage, willful blindness over difficult truth. The decision to drive to Henrik's farm that evening wasn't one Daniel made lightly. After treating Penny's wounds and settling her comfortably in the barn, he had spent hours wrestling with the implications of what Carl had done. The escalation, from hidden cruelty to brazen torture on their own property, represented a line crossed, a declaration of war against anyone who might interfere with his power over helpless creatures. Thomas had insisted on coming along, despite Daniel's concerns about his father's increasing confusion in unfamiliar situations. "This is partly my responsibility," the older man had said with a firmness that brooked no argument. "I saw the signs and remained silent. The least I can do is be present when the truth finally comes to light." The sun was setting as they drove the winding road to Henrik's farm, painting the autumn landscape in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Daniel kept glancing at his father, who sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally touching the pocket where he'd placed his written notes about Carl's pattern of cruelty, documentation that he'd been keeping despite his failing memory. "You've been recording your observations," Daniel said, not quite making it a question. Thomas nodded slowly. "Started a few months ago, when I realized my memory wasn't reliable anymore. Figured if I was going to make accusations someday, I'd better have something more solid than the word of a confused old man." The notebook his father pulled from his pocket was worn leather, the kind farmers had been using for generations to track breeding schedules and medical treatments. But instead of livestock records, its pages contained careful observations about timing, locations, and suspicious incidents involving Carl Mueller. "May I?" Daniel asked, and his father handed over the notebook. What Daniel found inside surprised him with its thoroughness and clarity. Despite his memory problems, Thomas had managed to document a pattern of escalating cruelty that went back 6 months. Dead chickens found with broken necks in places where predators couldn't have reached them. A neighbor's dog that had mysteriously ingested rat poison despite being kept indoors. Sheep found with unexplained injuries that healed poorly, suggesting interference with the natural healing process. Dad, this is incredibly detailed. Why didn't you show me this before? Because I wasn't sure I could trust my own perceptions anymore. Memory problems make you doubt everything, even things you know you saw clearly. I kept thinking maybe I was connecting dots that weren't really there, seeing patterns that existed only in a confused mind. Daniel felt a surge of admiration for his father's methodical approach to documenting something that must have been emotionally difficult to witness repeatedly. Even as his memory faltered in some areas, Thomas had found ways to preserve and organize information that might be crucial for protecting animals in their community. Henrik's farmhouse was dark, except for a single light in the kitchen window when they pulled into the driveway. The old man answered their knock immediately, as if he'd been waiting for them, and Daniel saw that his face bore the haggard expression of someone who had spent the day wrestling with impossible choices. "Thomas, Daniel," Henrik said, stepping aside to let them in. "I wondered if you might come by." The kitchen table was covered with papers, financial records, insurance documents, and what looked like legal forms. Henrik saw Daniel looking at them and managed a weak smile. "Trying to figure out how to run this place without Carl's help is not as simple as I thought it would be." "You've decided to confront him?" Thomas asked, settling into a chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints no longer bent easily. "I've decided I can't continue to pretend I don't know what he's doing. But Daniel, after you left this morning, I found something else." Henrik walked to a cabinet and pulled out a shoebox that he set on the table with trembling hands. "I've been cleaning out Carl's old room, and I found these." Inside the box was a collection that made Daniel's stomach turn. Photographs of injured animals, carefully arranged and catalogued. Small trophies, bits of fur, feathers, pieces of equipment used to inflict pain. And underneath it all, a journal written in Carl's precise handwriting, documenting his experiments in causing suffering. Daniel opened the journal with hands that weren't quite steady, reading entries that revealed a mind that had moved far beyond casual cruelty into something approaching scientific interest in pain. Carl had been recording not just what he did to animals, but how long they survived, how they responded to different types of injury, how much suffering he could inflict before they died. "When did this start?" Daniel asked, though he dreaded the answer. Henrik's voice was barely above a whisper. "According to the earliest entries, about 2 years ago, right after his mother died." The timeline provided a context that was both tragic and terrifying. Carl's descent into deliberate cruelty had begun as a response to grief and loss, but it evolved into something that bore no resemblance to normal human emotion. What had started as acting out had become a systematic study in inflicting pain. "There's more," Henrik continued, his hands shaking as he turned the pages. "He's been planning something bigger. He calls it the final experiment. According to his notes, he wants to see how long he can keep something alive while causing maximum suffering." Thomas leaned forward, his earlier confusion replaced by the sharp focus that sometimes emerged when he was confronted with immediate crisis. "Henrik, where's Carl now?" "I don't know. He left this afternoon after your visit, Daniel, and he hasn't come back. I tried calling him, but his phone goes straight to voicemail." Henrik gestured helplessly at the evidence spread across his table. "I don't know what to do. He's my son, but I can't let this continue." Daniel thought about Penny, recovering in their barn with injuries that would scar her for life. He thought about the A-way with the embedded baling twine, about all the other animals that had suffered, while good people struggled with the complexities of family, loyalty, and moral responsibility. "We have to call the authorities," Daniel said. This has gone beyond what we can handle as neighbors. And tell them what? Henrik asked. That my son tortures animals? They want proof, and when they find it, they'll arrest him. He'll go to prison, and I'll lose the only family I have left. You'll lose him anyway if this escalates, Thomas said gently. People who start with animals don't always stop with animals. The capacity for cruelty grows with feeding. The words hung in the air like a prophecy none of them wanted to contemplate. Daniel thought about his earlier confrontation with Carl, about the barely controlled anger he'd seen in the young man's eyes, about the way Carl had looked at him when he'd driven away, not with fear or shame, but with something that looked disturbingly like anticipation. There's something else, Henrik said quietly. According to his journal, Carl knows about your father's memory problems, Daniel. He's been watching your family, taking notes about your routines, your vulnerabilities. I think he sees Thomas as a perfect victim, someone whose word wouldn't be believed if he witnessed something terrible. The implications sent a chill through Daniel that had nothing to do with the autumn evening. Carl hadn't just escalated to attacking animals on their property. He was planning something that involved his father, something that would take advantage of Thomas's confusion and isolation. As if reading his thoughts, Thomas reached across the table and squeezed Daniel's hand. Son, I think it's time we stopped worrying about being good neighbors and started focusing on staying alive. The phone call came at 3 a.m, jarring Daniel from a restless sleep filled with dreams of wounded animals and his father's frightened eyes. The rotary phone in the kitchen rang with its old-fashioned brass bells, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet farmhouse. Daniel stumbled downstairs, expecting to find his father already answering. Thomas had always been a light sleeper, alert to any sound that might indicate trouble with the animals. But the kitchen was empty, the phone continuing its instant summons in the darkness. Hartwell Farm? Daniel said, his voice thick with sleep. Daniel? Thank God. It was Henrik, and his voice carried a terror that cut through Daniel's grogginess. Like ice water. Carl's gone. He's taken my truck, and Henrik's voice broke. Daniel, I think he's coming for your father. What do you mean he's coming for my father? Daniel was fully awake now, moving toward the stairs to check on Thomas. I found more pages in his journal, hidden under his mattress. He's been planning this for weeks. He knows your father sees him clearly despite the memory problems. Knows Thomas could identify him as the one hurting animals. But more than that, Henrik's voice dropped to a whisper. He sees your father as the perfect victim for his final experiment. An old man with memory problems whose word wouldn't be believed if he survived to tell what happened. Daniel took the stairs 2 at a time, the cordless phone pressed to his ear. His father's bedroom door was open, the bed empty and unmade. Dad? He called, his voice echoing through the house. No answer. Henrik, my father's not here. When did Carl leave? About an hour ago. I tried to stop him, but Henrik's voice, caught. He hit me, Daniel. Knocked me down and took my truck keys. Said it was time to stop pretending he was a good son and start being what he really was. Daniel's mind raced as he searched the house, checking every room, every closet, every place his father might be. But Thomas Hartwell was nowhere to be found, and the back door that led to the barn stood open, moving slightly in the night breeze. I'm calling the police, Daniel said, but Henrik's response stopped him cold. The phones are down. Carl cut the lines before he left. I'm calling from my cell phone, but the signal's weak and the battery's dying. Daniel, you need to. The line went dead. Daniel grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and ran toward the barn, calling his father's name. The familiar building felt ominous in the darkness, full of shadows that could hide any number of threats. But the animals were calm, a sign that no stranger had disturbed them recently. It wasn't until Daniel circled back toward the house that he saw the note, pinned to the kitchen door with a piece of the same baling twine that had become Carl's signature. The message was written in Carl's precise handwriting, lit by the porch light that Daniel had left burning. If you want to see your father alive again, come alone to the old quarry on Miters Road. Bring your veterinary bag. It's time to see how good you are at treating trauma when the patient is someone you actually care about. You have 1 hour. Daniel's hand shook as he read the words. The old quarry was a place where local kids had once gone swimming before it was abandoned and fenced off for safety reasons. It was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, and far enough from any neighbors that screams wouldn't carry. The note continued, "Peace, your father is unharmed for now, but confused. He thinks he's helping an injured animal. It's touching, really. How eager he was to come along when I told him one of his sheep was trapped and needed his help. Such a trusting man. I hope that trust isn't misplaced." Daniel crumpled the note in his fist, rage and terror warring in his chest. Carl had used his father's deepest instincts against him, compulsion to help suffering animals that had defined Thomas Hartwell's entire life. Even with his failing memory, Thomas would never ignore a call for help from a creature in distress. But as Daniel grabbed his veterinary bag and headed for his truck, something nagged at him of the note's phrasing. There was something too elaborate about it, too theatrical. Carl's journal entries had been clinical and cold, focused on documenting suffering rather than dramatic flourishes. This note felt different, as if it had been written for an audience rather than as a simple communication. Daniel paused with his hand on the truck's door handle, thinking about his father's notebook full of careful observations about the methodical way Thomas had documented Carl's pattern of cruelty despite his memory problems. His father might be confused about many things, but his understanding of human and animal nature remained sharp. What if Thomas hadn't been taken by surprise? What if he'd been preparing for something like this? Daniel ran back into the house and searched his father's room more carefully. In the drawer of the knitstand, hidden beneath a stack of old letters from Daniel's mother, he found a second notebook, this one smaller and more recent than the first. The pages contained not observations about Carl's cruelty, but plans. His father had been expecting this confrontation. The notebook revealed that Thomas had been leaving deliberate traces of his routine, making himself appear more vulnerable and isolated than he actually was. He'd been preparing the barn with escape routes and hiding places, positioning tools and supplies where they could be reached quickly in an emergency. Most importantly, he'd been in contact with the county sheriff, sharing his documentation about Carl's activities and requesting periodic patrols of their property. The final entry, dated that very day, was written in his father's still steady hand. "If something happens to me tonight, Daniel will try to come alone to help." This is exactly what Carl wants to graduate from torturing animals to torturing people, starting with the two of us. A two can play at psychological games. I may have trouble remembering where I put my keys, but I remember everything important about surviving dangerous situations. Carl thinks he's setting a trap, but he doesn't understand that sometimes the best way to catch a predator is to let him think he's already won. Daniel stared at the notebook, realization dawning. His father hadn't been taken. He'd allowed himself to be taken. Thomas was using himself as bait in a trap he'd been planning for weeks, relying on Daniel to figure out that things weren't what they seemed and respond accordingly. But the plan depended on Daniel understanding the message hidden in plain sight. And time was running out. Daniel looked at his watch. 43 minutes to get to the quarry. But now he had a choice to make: follow Carl's instructions and walk into what was certainly a trap, or trust his father's plan and hope that a man with failing memory had managed to outthink a calculating sociopath. The veterinary bag sat on the kitchen table, packed with everything he'd need to treat trauma injuries. Next to it lay his father's notebook, containing a different kind of preparation entirely. Daniel realized that both approaches would be necessary: the medical training to help whoever got hurt, and the strategic thinking to ensure that the Right person ended up needing treatment. He grabbed both the bag and the notebook. But instead of heading directly to his truck, Daniel made one more search of the house. In his father's closet, behind a collection of worn work shirts, he found what he was looking for: Thomas Hartwell's old Army footlocker, containing items from his service in Vietnam that Daniel had rarely seen but always known were there. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were tools that had nothing to do with farming and everything to do with surviving encounters with dangerous people. His father had been more prepared for this confrontation than anyone realized, including Carl Dodd, as Daniel drove toward the quarry. He found himself thinking about the difference between victim and veteran, between confusion and strategy, between the kind of memory that forgets where you put your glasses and the kind that never forgets how to stay alive when someone wants to hurt you. Carl Mueller was about to discover that some old farmers had learned their most important lessons in places that had nothing to do with raising sheep. The drive to the old quarry took Daniel through countryside he'd known since childhood, but tonight the familiar roads felt like pathways into unknown territory. Every curve revealed by his headlights could hide Carl's stolen truck. Every shadow could conceal an ambush. The weight of his father's military equipment in the back seat served as a constant reminder that the man he'd been thinking of as increasingly frail had been keeping significant secrets about his capabilities. Daniel's mind raced as he tried to reconcile the father he thought he knew with the strategic thinker revealed in the hidden notebook. Thomas Hartwell, who forgot sheep names and left stoves burning, had apparently been conducting a sophisticated intelligence operation against Carl Mueller. The memory problems were real, but they had also provided perfect cover for appearing more vulnerable than he actually was. 20 minutes into the drive, Daniel's cell phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "You're taking too long. Your father is getting impatient to begin his lesson in pain management. Speed up or I'll start without you." The message was accompanied by a photo that made Daniel's blood run cold. His father sitting on the ground near the quarry's edge, his hands bound behind him, but his eyes alert and focused in a way that contradicted Carl's assumption that he was dealing with a confused old man. Daniel texted back, "I'm coming. Don't hurt him." The response came immediately. "Hurt him? I'm going to educate him. Same way I educated all those animals. Your father is going to learn what real suffering feels like, and you're going to watch. Then you're going to experience it yourself. Consider it graduate-level veterinary training." Daniel pushed the accelerator harder, but forced himself to think tactically rather than emotionally. Carl wanted him panicked and rushing, making mistakes that would put both him and his father at greater risk. The text messages were psychological warfare, designed to break down Daniel's ability to think clearly, but his father's notebook had prepared him for this too. In the margins of several pages, Thomas had written observations about Carl's psychology, noting his need for control and attention, his tendency to escalate when he felt ignored, and most importantly, his overconfidence in his own cleverness. "Carl sees himself as the smartest person in a room," one note read. "But intelligence and cunning are different things. He's book smart about cruelty, but he's never dealt with someone who's been trained to survive worse situations than anything he can devise. His biggest weakness is that he thinks everyone else thinks like he does." 5 miles from the quarry, Daniel pulled off the road and parked behind an abandoned gas station that had been closed for a decade. He needed to approach the final location carefully, with preparation rather than panic. Opening his father's footlocker in the truck's cab, he inventoried the contents by flashlight. The items told a story about Thomas Hartwell that Daniel had never heard. Military medals he'd never seen displayed, including a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. Photographs of a young man in army fatigues standing with other soldiers in what looked like Vietnamese jungle. And practical items that spoke of someone who had learned to survive in hostile territory. Night vision equipment, tactical gear, and most importantly, a detailed hand-drawn map of the quarry area with notations about sightlines, escape routes, and defensive positions. His father hadn't just been planning to let himself be taken. He'd been conducting reconnaissance of the location where he expected the final confrontation to occur. Daniel studied the map, understanding for the first time that his father's weekend walks around the valley hadn't been aimless wandering by a confused old man, but systematic scouting by someone preparing for a specific type of operation. Thomas had been mapping every approach to the quarry, every hiding place, every tactical advantage the terrain might offer. A handwritten note clipped to the map explained the strategy. Carl will expect us to approach from the road, the most obvious route. He'll position himself where he can see anyone coming from that direction. But the quarry can be approached from 3 other directions, including a deer path that comes down from the ridge behind the old processing building. That approach puts the sun at your back in the morning and provides cover right up to the quarry's edge. The note continued, Carl's weakness is that he's never been in a real fight with someone who fights back effectively. All his victims have been helpless. He won't expect coordinated resistance, especially from people he considers inferior to himself. Use his arrogance against him. Daniel checked his watch. 22 minutes until Carl's deadline. But his father's plan wasn't built around meeting Carl's timeline. It was built around creating their own timing, their own terms of engagement. Following the map, Daniel drove to a fire road that wound up the ridge behind the quarry. The route was longer, but would bring him into position without Carl knowing he was there. As he drove, Daniel found himself thinking about all the times he'd underestimated his father's capabilities, all the moments when he'd seen confusion and weakness instead of recognizing strategic thinking. The memory problems were real, but they had become a kind of camouflage, making Thomas appear less competent and aware than he actually was. Carl had fallen for the same misconception that Daniel had, seeing an old man with failing faculties instead of a combat veteran who understood how to survive dangerous situations. The deer path was exactly where the map indicated, winding down through oak and maple trees that provided excellent cover. Daniel moved carefully, using the night vision equipment his father had left for him, taking time to understand the terrain before committing to any approach. From the ridge, he could see the quarry spread out below, a roughly circular excavation, filled with dark water, surrounded by steep walls of cut stone. Carl's truck was parked near the old access road, positioned to block the most obvious escape route. Portable lights had been set up around a flat area near the water's edge, creating a stage where Carl could conduct whatever he had planned. In the circle of artificial light, Daniel could see his father clearly for the first time. Thomas sat with his back against a concrete post, his hands bound, but his posture alert rather than defeated. Even from a distance, Daniel could tell that his father was studying his surroundings, cataloging details and possibilities with the systematic attention of someone planning his next move. Carl paced around the lighted area, talking animatedly, though Daniel couldn't hear the words from his position. The young man's body language spoke of excitement and anticipation. He was enjoying the build-up to whatever he had planned, savoring the sense of control and power. But as Daniel watched through the night vision scope, he noticed something that Carl apparently hadn't. His father wasn't just sitting passively, he was working at his bonds, using some technique that was gradually loosening the rope that held his hands. And more importantly, Thomas was positioning himself near something Daniel recognized from the map, one of several emergency caches his father had apparently hidden around the quarry during his reconnaissance missions. Daniel's phone buzzed with another message. 10 minutes late. Your father is getting restless. I've decided to start his education early. Maybe the sounds will encourage you to hurry. But instead of panic, Daniel felt a cold calm settle over him. This was exactly what his father had predicted Carl would do: escalate the threats, try to force a rushed response. create chaos that would mask his own vulnerabilities. Daniel began his descent toward the quarry, moving with the patience his father's notes had emphasized. Carl wanted a panicked rescue attempt that would deliver both victims into his hands simultaneously. Instead, he was going to get a coordinated response from two people who understood that the best way to deal with a predator was to become better predators themselves. The sounds of Carl's voice carried more clearly as Daniel got closer, and what he heard confirmed everything his father had written about the young man's psychology. Carl was talking to Thomas like he was conducting a lecture, explaining his theories about pain and suffering, describing the experiments he'd conducted on animals as if they were scientific research rather than torture. The fascinating thing about sheep, Carl was saying, is how long they'll endure pain before they give up hope. Much longer than you'd expect from such stupid creatures. I'm curious to see if humans have the same tolerance for suffering, or if intelligence makes you give up faster. Thomas's response when it came was delivered in the calm, measured tone of someone who had faced worse threats than anything Carl could devise. Son, you're about to find out that there's a big difference between causing pain and surviving it, and you're going to learn which side of that equation you're really on. Daniel smiled grimly as he took his final position. His father might have trouble remembering where he put his keys, but apparently he'd never forgotten how to conduct psychological warfare. The real education was about to begin, and Carl Mueller was going to discover that his most important lesson would come from his intended victims. The moment Carl raised the cattle prod he'd brought from his father's farm, Daniel understood that his father's patience had reached its tactical limit. Thomas had been allowing Carl to feel in control, letting the young man work himself into the state of overconfident excitement that would make him careless and vulnerable. But the introduction of an electric torture device changed the equation entirely. You know what I love about electricity? Carl said, testing the prod's charge with a spark that lit up his face with grotesque satisfaction. It's so much more precise than other methods. I can control exactly how much pain to deliver, exactly where to deliver it, exactly how long to make it last. Daniel was still 50 yards away, working his way down the rocky slope with the careful movements his father's notes had emphasized, but he could see that Thomas had almost finished freeing his hands. The rope loosened to the point where only Carl's attention was keeping him from breaking free entirely. The animals taught me that the key is variation, Carl continued, circling around Thomas like a predator playing with wounded prey. Too much pain too fast and they go into shock, lose consciousness. Too little and they adapt, become resistant. But the right amount, applied in the right sequence, that can keep a subject conscious and responsive for hours. Thomas looked up at Carl with an expression that Daniel recognized from childhood. The look his father got when he was about to teach someone an important lesson about underestimating him. Son, Thomas said quietly, you've made a fundamental error in your research. Carl paused, cattle prod halfway to Thomas's shoulder. What error? You've been experimenting on victims. You've never tested your theories on someone who knows how to fight back. The words were delivered with such calm certainty that Carl hesitated, some instinct warning him that the dynamic was shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated. But his need for control overrode his caution, and he pressed the cattle prod against Thomas's arm. What happened next unfolded with the speed and precision of someone who had spent decades training muscle memory to respond faster than conscious thought. Thomas's hands came free of the loosened rope just as the electric shock hit him, but instead of crying out or pulling away, he grabbed the prod's metal contacts and held on, using his body to complete the circuit while his other hand moved to the cache he'd positioned himself near. Carl tried to pull the prod away, but Thomas's grip was iron strong, and the electrical feedback was now flowing both directions. The young man screamed as the current traveled back through the device. His muscles spasming as he experienced the same sensation he'd planned to inflict. "The thing about electricity," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the pain coursing through his own body, "is that it flows in circuits. And the thing about circuits is that they can be turned against the person trying to control them." Daniel used Carl's screams to cover the sound of his final approach, emerging from the shadows just as his father released the cattle prod and rolled toward the emergency cache. Carl staggered backward, his hands shaking from the electrical shock, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. "You old bastard," Carl snarled, pulling a hunting knife from his belt. "I'm going to cut you apart piece by piece." But Thomas was no longer where Carl expected him to be. The emergency cache had contained exactly what the tactical notes had. Promised a flare gun, which Thomas fired directly into Carl's face. The young man screamed again, this time in genuine terror as the bright red flare bloomed in the air above him, destroying his night vision and announcing to anyone within miles that something was happening at the quarry. Daniel took advantage of Carl's temporary blindness to close the remaining distance, but his approach was noticed just as he reached the edge of the lighted area. Carl spun toward him, the knife weaving through the air in wild slashes that spoke more of panic than skill. "Daniel, I was hoping you'd get here in time to watch your father die. Now you can die together." But the Carl who faced Daniel was not the confident tormentor who had been lecturing Thomas about pain tolerance. This was a young man whose carefully planned scenario had dissolved into chaos, whose assumed superiority had been shattered by an old farmer who refused to play the role of helpless victim. Daniel drew the tactical knife his father had left in the equipment cache, holding it with the proper grip Thomas had taught him during long-ago camping trips. "Carl, it's over." The flare was a signal. "People are coming." "Nobody's coming," Carl screamed, but his voice carried the edge of desperation. "Nobody cares about a crazy old man and his veterinary school dropout son." Thomas appeared at Carl's flank, moving with the fluid competence of someone whose military training had never really left him. "Son, you're about to learn the difference between hurting helpless creatures and fighting people who know how to hurt you back." The real confrontation was just beginning, and Carl Mueller was discovering that. His education in violence had barely scratched the surface of what the Hartwell men were prepared to teach him. The final confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes, but those minutes contained lessons that would reshape Daniel's understanding of his father, himself, and the nature of real courage. Carl lunged at Thomas first, the hunting knife aimed at the older man's chest in a wild stabbing motion that revealed his complete lack of experience with actual combat. Thomas sidestepped the attack with economical precision, using Carl's momentum against him in a way that sent the young man stumbling past his intended target. "First lesson," Thomas said calmly, as Carl struggled to regain his balance. "Anger makes you stupid, and stupid gets you killed." Carl spun around, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You think you're so smart, old man? You think your military bullshit is going to save you." "Second lesson," Thomas continued, positioning himself between Carl and Daniel with movements that seemed casual but were clearly calculated. "Never announce your intentions. Just act." Carl charged again, this time trying to tackle Thomas around the waist, but the older man was ready for him. Thomas caught Carl's wrist as the knife descended, twisting it with sudden violence that made the young man scream and drop his weapon. The blade clattered across the concrete, coming to rest near the quarry's edge. "Third lesson," Thomas said, maintaining his grip on Carl's wrist while applying pressure that kept the young man immobilized. "Control distance, control timing, control the weapon, control everything." Daniel watched in amazement as his father, the man he'd been worried about leaving alone with a stove, demonstrated combat skills that belonged to a different lifetime, but had never really faded. Every movement was deliberate. Every action served multiple purposes. Every word was calculated to maintain psychological dominance over their opponent. But Carl wasn't finished. As Thomas adjusted his grip, the young man pulled a second knife from his boot, a smaller blade that he swept toward the older man's ribs in a move that caught Thomas momentarily off guard. Daniel moved without thinking, his own knife intercepting Carl's blade just inches from his father's body. The impact sent vibrations up both men's arms, but Daniel had the better angle and the steadier grip. Carl's second knife joined the first on the ground. "Nice timing," Thomas said approvingly, as if Daniel had just successfully administered a difficult injection rather than prevented a stabbing. Carl backed away from both men, his hands empty but his eyes wild with the kind of desperation that made him more dangerous rather than less. "This isn't over," he panted. "You think you've won something, but all you've done is make me angrier." "Fourth lesson," Thomas said, pulling a length of rope from his emergency cache. "Know when the fight is finished, even if your opponent doesn't." What followed was a demonstration in restraint techniques that left Carl bound more securely than he had ever managed with any of his animal victims. Thomas worked with methodical efficiency, creating knots that would tighten if struggled against, but wouldn't cut off circulation. "The difference between us and you," Daniel said, as his father finished securing Carl, "is that we know how to stop. You never learned when enough was enough." Carl looked up at them from the ground, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been the beginning of actual fear. "What are you going to do with me?" Thomas sat down on a nearby concrete block, suddenly looking every one of his 74 years again. The adrenaline was wearing off, and Daniel could see the toll the confrontation had taken on his father's aging body. "We're going to turn you over to the sheriff," Thomas said simply. "Along with all the evidence your father collected, all the documentation I've been keeping, and your own journal describing your experiments. They'll never convict me based on the word of a confused old man and some circumstantial evidence," Carl said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Son," Thomas replied, "I may forget where I put my reading glasses, but I remember everything important about taking photographs, preserving evidence, and documenting crimes. You've been under surveillance for months, and everything you've done is recorded." Daniel heard the sound of vehicles approaching long before their headlights became visible on the access road. His father's flare had indeed been a signal, and the response time suggested that law enforcement had been positioned closer than Carl had realized. "Fifth lesson," Thomas said as the first sheriff's car pulled into the quarry. "Always have backup, and always have an exit strategy." Sheriff Patricia Wade stepped out of the lead vehicle, followed by two deputies and Henrik Mueller, who looked simultaneously relieved and heartbroken. The older man walked directly to where Carl lay bound, staring down at his son with an expression of profound sadness. "I'm sorry it came to this," Henrik said quietly. Carl looked up at his father without a trace of remorse. "I'm sorry I didn't finish what I started." The words hung in the night air like a final confession, removing any doubt about Carl's character or intentions. Daniel felt a wave of sadness, not for Carl, but for Henrik, who would have to live with the knowledge of what his son had become. As the deputies took Carl into custody, Sheriff Wade approached Thomas and Daniel with the measured pace of someone who had seen enough violence to recognize its aftermath. "Mr. Hartwell, are you injured?" Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his face back into the gentle farmer Daniel knew. "Nothing that won't heal, Sheriff. Nothing that won't heal." 3 months later, Daniel stood in the same kitchen where this story had begun, watching his father prepare breakfast with the same methodical care he brought to everything important in his life. The morning light filtered through the windows, exactly as it had that September day when Henrik first called about his limping away. But everything else had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Thomas moved around the kitchen with renewed confidence, his memory problems no less real than before, but no longer a source of shame or fear. The revelation of his tactical competence had reframed his occasional confusion about everyday matters. Forgetting where he placed his keys seemed less significant when balanced against his ability to outthink and outmaneuver someone half his age who had intended to torture him. "Coffee's ready," Thomas announced, pouring 2 cups with hands that were steadier than they'd been in months. "And before you ask, yes, I remembered to turn off the stove." Daniel smiled, accepting the cup and settling into his usual chair at the oak table. Their morning routine had evolved to include discussions that would have been impossible before the night. At the quarry, conversations about Thomas's military service, about the difference between age-related forgetfulness and genuine incompetence, about the plans they were making together for the farm's future. "Any word from Henrik?" Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. Henrik called every few days, partly to check on their well-being, partly because he needed to maintain connections with people who understood what it meant to love someone who had disappointed you beyond forgiveness. "He stopped by yesterday while you were at school," Thomas replied. "Wanted to let us know Carl's plea hearing when is expected. 20 years for animal cruelty, assault, and attempted kidnapping. He'll be eligible for parole in 12. The justice felt appropriate, if not entirely satisfying. Carl would spend his most productive years in an environment where he would be the vulnerable one, where his capacity for cruelty would be checked by people more experienced in violence than he could ever become. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was sufficient justice. How's Henrik handling it? About as well as any father would handle watching his son led away in handcuffs. He's selling the farm, moving to be closer to his sister in Pennsylvania. Says he can't stay in a place where every animal reminds him of what Carl did to them. Daniel nodded, understanding the decision while regretting the loss of a good neighbor. Henrik's departure would leave a gap in the community, but it would also allow him to escape the daily reminders of his son's cruelty. The kitchen fell into comfortable silence, broken only by the sound of Thomas turning pages in the morning newspaper and the distant bleating of sheep calling for their breakfast. Daniel had deferred his internship at the prestigious veterinary practice in the state capital, choosing instead to spend another year helping his father transition the farm's operations while completing his studies through an extended program. That allowed him to work from home. It had been the right decision, though not for the reasons he'd initially thought. Rather than staying to help a failing father, Daniel had discovered he was learning from a man whose competence ran deeper than either of them had fully realized. Thomas might need help remembering medication schedules and appointment times, but his understanding of land management, animal behavior, and human nature remained as sharp as ever. "I've been thinking about expanding the flock," Thomas said, looking up from the newspaper. "Henrik's sheep will need new homes, and his pasture will be available for lease. What do you think about taking on 40 more ewes?" It was exactly the kind of forward-thinking decision that proved Thomas's mind remained clear about everything that mattered most. "I think it's a good plan," Daniel replied. "We've got the infrastructure, and the additional income would help with the farm's long-term sustainability." "Good. I've already talked to the bank about extending our operating loan." Thomas folded the newspaper and looked directly at Daniel. "Son, I want you to know that what happened with Carl taught me something important about the difference between needing help and being helpless. I may need assistance with some things, but I'm still capable of making decisions about the things I understand best." Daniel felt a wave of respect for his father's insight. The events at the quarry had forced both of them to reconsider their assumptions about age, competence, and independence. Thomas's memory problems were real and would likely worsen over time, but they didn't negate his wisdom, experience, or ability to contribute meaningfully to decisions about their shared future. "I never thought you were helpless, Dad. Confused about some things, maybe, but never helpless. But you were starting to treat me like I was, and I was starting to feel like I was." Thomas reached across the table and squeezed Daniel's hand. That night at the quarry reminded me that there's a difference between being old and being defeated. Carl made the mistake of thinking they were the same thing. Through the kitchen window, Daniel could see Penny grazing in the near pasture, her injured leg bearing only the slightest trace of a limp. She had recovered completely from Carl's torture, retaining none of the fear or wariness that might have been expected after such trauma. Animals, Daniel had learned, were often more resilient than the people who cared for them. "The veterinary college called yesterday," Daniel said. "They want me to present a paper about psychological factors in animal cruelty cases at their spring conference." "That's wonderful. What's your thesis?" "That cruelty usually escalates when it goes unchallenged, but it can be stopped by people who refuse to look away from suffering. That the most important veterinary skill might be the courage to speak up when you see something wrong." Thomas smiled, and Daniel saw in that expression the same warmth and wisdom that had guided him through childhood, unchanged by memory problems or the passage of time. "Your mother would be proud. She always said the mark of a good person was someone who protected creatures that couldn't protect themselves." As they finished their coffee and prepared to start the day's work, Daniel reflected on how much had changed since that morning when Henrik called about his limping sheep. He had learned that healing wasn't just about antibiotics and bandages, that some wounds were hidden beneath the surface, and that sometimes the most important discoveries came from having the courage to look closely at things others preferred to ignore. The baling twine that had started it all now served a different purpose. Securing hay bales in their barn returned to its proper function of holding things together rather than causing them to fall apart. It was a small symbol of how perspective could transform even the most ordinary objects into reminders of deeper truths. Sometimes coming home meant facing the things you'd been running from, but sometimes it meant discovering that the people you thought needed protecting were actually the ones who could teach you the most about courage.